Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. My name is Jonathan M.S. Pearce and I'm going to continue our walk through Hector Aavlos' brilliant book, Slavery, Abolitionism and the Ethics of Biblical Scholarship. It's kind of a book club treatment or a sort of exposition of his book, so there's a lot of me reading. But if you've got this far, this is video number 5, then you know exactly what I'm doing. This is a continuation from the last video because chapter 4, dealing with the slavery in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, is a long chapter and has a lot of Hector Aavlos goes through all the different instantiations of slavery in the Hebrew Bible and sees them in terms of how different biblical scholars deal with them and apologize for them. Remember, we are dealing with 3 main apologetic techniques or methods. First is reinterpretation. That's pretty obvious, which is how can we reinterpret what was understood originally to be said in the Bible in new ways that are much nicer, more morally, in line with our progressed moral values. Next one is representativism, which is cherry picking. Basically it's saying, and we're going to deal with this one and the next one mainly in the rest of this chapter. So representativism is taking one verse and saying, well, this represents the Bible morally, and kind of forgetting all these other verses that say things that are quite different or worse or whatever. So that is basically cherry picking. And the other version is trajectorialism, which is that we're on a trajectory up to this, progressed moral realization up here, but the Bible is either the starting point or a necessary waypoint along this trajectory, and without that we wouldn't have got this trajectory. So it's understanding, it's admitting that yes, there's slavery in the Bible, but hey, it's better than what there was. And a lot of what we're going to see is basically cherry picking to say, well, yeah, this example of slavery here is maybe slightly better than over here, but there are worse examples. And so how do you explain that? Or trajectorialism, there's going to be a lot of that we're going to talk about, which is to say that actually there are examples in the ancient Near East contemporaneously or previously to the writing of the Hebrew Bible that are at least equal to what we find in the Bible, and in many instances better, which means that if you're saying the Bible is a necessary starting point, actually we've got previous starting points that appear better than the Bible. So it's a bump and then Bible going down, or the Bible isn't the starting point at all, and so therefore you have a problem in stating that the Bible is this key moral benchmark or key moral foundation upon which the progress is built. So that's what we're going to be dealing with. Last time we got as far as I think Exodus 20. I'm going to start with Exodus 21 verses 1 to 6, dealing with term limits, and this is setting the limit of how long you can keep a slave for. And Exodus 21 says the most important part, I mean, it says quite a lot, but I'll just read the first 3 lines, which is, or 3 lines from me. Now these are the ordinances which you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. So this idea that, look how wonderful the Hebrews were. They let slaves go in the 7th year. So it wasn't like slavery forever. But actually Law 117 of the Code of Hammurabi, which predates the Bible by quite some time, offers terms superior to those of Exodus. So again, what does this say about the trajectory? Because we're starting off up here and we go down to the Bible before then getting better. It's like, well, okay, so the Bible is worse, so it's morally worse. So it just completely refutes the trajectorial approach. Law 117 says, it says quite a bit, but here it says, they shall perform service in the house of their buyer or of the one who holds them in debt service for 3 years. Their release shall be secured in the 4th year. It's a bit of a problem because the Bible says the 7th year. So thus, as this is Hector Aavlos on page 77, thus the Code of Hammurabi, a person serves only half as long as in the Hebrew case. Notice also the Code of Hammurabi is more equal in its treatment of native and foreign slaves in this case, as opposed to Exodus, which specifies that this limited service applies only to Hebrew slaves. That's a really important point, because there's a lot in the Hebrew Bible. There are two versions of slavery, basically. There's Hebrew slaves, and there are slaves you can get, say, after a battle, after war, you're captured, enemy soldiers or their families or whatever, and you can do with them almost, what you will to some degree, whereas Hebrew slaves are treated a lot better. So there's that underwrites a lot of the cherry picking that goes on, which is like, oh, look at this version of slavery. Yeah, but that's only for the Hebrew slaves. What about all the other slaves? As Aavlos continues on page 77, moreover, non-Hebrew slaves, especially those captured in war, are owned forever and may be inherited. Thus, we could claim that Hebrew law represents a regression compared to the Code of Hammurabi insofar as limits of servitude are concerned. So, first example of slavery in today's video, it proves itself to be a really big problem for those methodological approaches that apologists use. And then we're going to move on to Exodus 21:16 and man stealing. So according to Exodus 21:16, whoever steals a man, whether he sells him or is found in possession of him, shall be put to death. And today some biblical scholars still credit this verse with bringing a humanitarian advance, says Hector Aavlos. Joe Sprinkle, so this is a biblical apologist and scholar, adds applaudit to biblical ethics when he remarks, so this is from Joe Sprinkle, Biblical Law and Its Relevance, a Christian Understanding and Ethical Application for Today of the Mosaic Regulations. Long title. So this is what Joe Sprinkle says. Kidnapping is generally related to the slave trade because transcendent life value is involved in stealing a human being. That made it unlike a case merely involving animals. Thus, kidnapping was subject to the maximum penalty regardless of whether the kidnapper disposed of the person stolen. And Aavlos here says, again, page 77, Sprinkle concludes that biblical law values, this is a quote from Sprinkle, biblical law values human life above property to a greater degree than cuneiform law. So basically the idea is that the progress of the Bible here, in terms of the other ancient Near Eastern laws, is that human life is valued to a greater degree. Because cuneiform law, says Aavlos, assigns a death penalty for stealing non-human property, while the Bible assigns it only for stealing human beings. So there's a differentiation between humans and other property. Of course, says Aavlos, Sprinkle is engaging in representativism, so is he cherry picking it, by selecting a cuneiform law that he then generalizes to the entire Near East. And we saw this in previous videos, this kind of idea of like, I'm going to take this ancient Near Eastern law and this represents all ancient Near Eastern laws and societies. The ancient Near East, there was a number of different places over a number of different times, and so just to pick one law to represent that entire collection of moral laws is and life is really, really problematic. So there you go. But cuneiform law is not representative of all Near Eastern law, and he goes on to show this. Aavlos, for the reasons of time, I won't go into all the details here. But you got the laws of Eshnunna. Property crimes are not necessarily punished by death. Law 6 says if a man under fraudulent circumstances should seize a boat which does not belong to him, he shall weigh and deliver 10 shekels of silver. And law 24 of Eshnunna says if a man seizes a wife or child of a man as debt slaves and no seized persons die in the captor's custody, then the latter will die. So then here we see in these particular ancient Near Eastern laws exactly the same differentiation between property and the value of human life. Yet we do not find Sprinkle praising those ancient Near Eastern laws. Again, representativism. He's taking a particular law that supports his case and applies that as a generalization across all those laws, and that is incorrect. the laws of Eshonana, impose monetary fines for theft of objects, but in terms of human, debt slaves who are killed, you get punishment by death. Aavlos continues on page 78 that a more significant problem for Sprinkle's conclusion is that we can find cuneiform laws that fare much better against the Bible. Again, this puts paid to trajectorialism, as we have seen previously. Code of Hammurabi Law 14 states, quote, "If a man should kidnap the child of another man, he shall be killed." Kidnapping children can also be related to the slave trade, in which case the Bible fares far worse. Consider what the biblical author allows Hebrews to do to Midianite virgins. So this is from Numbers 31:17 to 18 and 41. "Now, therefore, kill every male along with the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves." And Moses gave the tribute, which was the offering for the Lord, to Eleazar the priest, as the Lord commanded Moses. So some pretty reprehensible usage of virgin girls and women for the ends of the Israelites here, or the Hebrews. And Aavlos says of this, basically the biblical author is allowing the killing of the families of these young virgins, who are then taken for what can be described as sexual slavery, as consent cannot be presumed on the part of these girls. Numbers 31:41 specifies that this abduction of virgins is part of God's plan and not some rogue human action. And we also see this in Joshua 6:21 and 24. Verses 21 and 24. So, this happens throughout the Bible quite a bit, and it is morally abhorrent. That Numbers 31 alone, I mean, what happens is people end up being Christians and believing the Bible because it's wrapped up with their entire sort of moral life and their familial life and their social life and their existential sort of being. All of this is wrapped up together, and so there's an awful lot of generosity that is accorded the Bible that is just not justified. And if I was to read without knowing anything, and I came to the Bible as a supposed moral sort of moral book, moral guide, and I saw that passage alone, I would be, this book ain't for me. I mean, that is, the Bible loses on that passage alone. And yet Christians can either kind of compartmentalize or just, or forget about that, or don't know about that, or all sorts of different things, or they use these kind of techniques that we're exploring at the moment. And it's not good enough. It's not good enough. Aavlos continues on page 78. Without entering into all the legal complexities of the so-called Hebrew ban institution, it is apparent that there are instances where objects were spared and treasured while human and animal life were both destroyed. Humans and animals were treated exactly alike here, but Sprinkle does not denounce taking virgins as sex slaves or killing entire groups of people, which is in Joshua 6, while keeping their material possessions when it occurs in the Bible. So again, he's not only, so Sprinkle here is not only using representativism to carefully select ancient Near Eastern laws that support his case, but he's ignoring biblical laws that do not support his case. And that's a real problem. Aavlos goes on to talk about elements of this in Matthew 5:38 to 41, and discuss a whole lot more, which I won't go into. But he does go on in page 74 to talk about Fred Ross, who was a slave advocate, a Christian slave advocate. Always interesting to listen to them because they themselves present the counter case to abolitionist Christians. And, they show the obvious lack of clarity that the Bible has in terms of what it says on slavery. And Fred Ross said, the time then set forth in the Bible was not selling a man, but selling a stolen man. Aavlos talks about this, and I'm skipping a little bit here, but the fact that abducting people could be regarded as permissible was supported by the episode at Jabesh Gilead, where 400 virgins were abducted to provide wives for the Benjaminites in Judges 21:17 to 24. However, it is not clear that the narrator approves of this action at all, especially as these are Israelite women being abducted. Abducting Midianite virgins, however, does have divine approval, as we have seen. And there's this idea that you get, two types of humans here who are accorded two different types of laws, and you have your in-group out-group mentality, where literally the value of the human life for the in-group, it far outstrips the value of the human life for the out-group, whereas all human life under God should surely be the same and mean the same and have the same value. More problems. Exodus 21:20 and killing slaves. So again, this is all, there's so much about slavery in Exodus, such a key book. According to Rodney Stark, who, remember we talked about, is an apologist for Christianity in terms of history and sociology. He's a sociologist, I think, but has dipped his rather large toes into the world of history to try and justify Christianity across lots of different areas. And he says, Rodney Stark this is, in The Glory for God, says death was decreed for any Jewish master who killed a slave, which is to say, Stark's trying to say, look, if you're a slave master and you kill a slave, hey, you get sentenced to death, and that just shows how well protected slaves are. But it's not so clear what he's referring to. So the nearest text that Stark seems to cite for any support of this is Exodus 21:26 to 27, which really doesn't speak of the issue. So he's making these claims, but he's not really citing his sources, well enough. It could be that he's referring to Exodus 21:20, which says, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. In either case, as Aavlos says on page 80, Stark is uninformed about problems with the interpretation of the Hebrew here. It's where Aavlos, is a world above someone like Stark, because he can, perfectly well look into the Hebrew and do a textual and lexical analysis of the language, of the original text. Aavlos says the main problem is that the Hebrew root, and I won't say the word, translated as punished, does not necessarily, because I don't understand the transliteration, does not necessarily mean that the slave master is killed. Usually, death penalty cases use a Hebrew expression, mot yamat, he shall surely die. Note that the NRSV, REB, and NAB have punished and not killed. Similarly, the New Jerusalem Bible has paid a penalty and not killed. In other words, when Rodney Stark is saying death was decreed for any Jewish master who killed a slave, the Bible doesn't say that. It says there's punishment, but there's not death. And he also doesn't cite exactly what sort of verse he's referring to. So again, you've got to watch your claims of some of these apologists who are just making pretty shoddy assertions and claims. The next one is Exodus 21, again 26 to 27, which is beating manumission. So Aavlos says on page 80, Rodney Stark cites the Hebrew law wherein, quote, freedom was to be awarded any slave as compensation for suffering acts of violence. So if a slave suffered violence at the hands of a slave master, then they were to be awarded freedom, manumission. So he refers to the laws in Exodus 21:26 to 27, which say, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free for the eye's sake. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free for the tooth's sake. And back to Aavlos. So Stark's assertion is half true at best. Freedom was granted for loss of certain organs only, and these included eyes and teeth. However, freedom was not granted for suffering other acts of violence, as is clear just a few verses later, 20 to 21, a few verses earlier, sorry, which the Exodus quote is, "When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be punished, for the slave is his money." Very much property and the devaluation of the human life involved there. So why does Stark not regard these as acts of violence that merit freedom? A Hebrew master can beat a slave nearly to death and not fear any punishments. The reason given is because a slave is his money, and money is a thing, not a human being. This is the idea that the slave is his money, is the property of the slave master, very overtly, but also it's an investment, isn't it? So, you know, you start beating your slave, you're damaging your own sort of future financial security. And, you know, there's very much a, you know, this isn't so much about the slave, it's about the slave master. This is protecting the financial security of the slave master rather than protecting the slave as a human being. I mean, it's pretty dodgy. You know, Aavlos on page 81 says, however, even if his money referred only figuratively to the slave master hurting his own income, this still does not mean that the slave is viewed as better than chattel or an animal in this situation. Wasting your money could equally apply to destroying chattel. A master is also not punished for beating his own animals. Accordingly, the phrase, "because the slave is his money," does not preclude understanding the harm to a slave as any more offensive than harm to a master's animal or non-living property. The inhumanity of this biblical law is even more apparent when one compares it to the laws of Athens. In regard to violence against slaves at Athens, Xenophon says, "You can't hit them there." So, you know, with someone like Rodney Stark saying, "Oh, look at how wonderful this law is compared to others," it's like, well, we can find better laws around, and so, you know, Stark is sort of again cherry picking, but also, you know, those laws are really pretty bad and don't quite do what Stark says. I mean, they are simply seeing the slaves as chattel and human property. I mean, the laws 170 and 171 of the Code of Hammurabi, you know, offer even better manumission criteria. Plato as well encourages freeing a slave who rescues a father or mother being attacked by their children. Plato's quoted, "And if a slave can come to the rescue, let him be made free, and no beating is necessary to be freed." And yeah, laws 170 and 171 of the Code of Hammurabi describe what happens to the estate of a man who has children by both his first-ranking wife and his slave woman. So these are the laws here. If a man's first-ranking wife bears him children and his slave woman bears him children, and the father during his lifetime then declares or concerning the children whom the slave woman bore to him, "my children," and he reckons them with the children of his first-ranking wife, after the father goes to his fate, dies, the children of the first-ranking wife and the children of the slave woman shall equally divide the property of the paternal estate. The preferred heir is a son of the first-ranking wife. He shall select and take a share first. In other words, you know, children of a slave woman to the master are given the rights of inheritance of the estate of the slave master. You know, if the patriarch does not adopt the children of his slave woman, then, this is a quote from the law, "the release of the slave woman and her children shall be secured. The children of the first-ranking wife will not make claims of slavery against the children of the slave woman." So here we've got, you know, a very particular law, a set of laws in the Code of Hammurabi that appear to be far more progressive than the biblical laws that we find. The idea is that the Bible accords, you know, freedom for slaves if they're beaten, they lose an eye and tooth. Here we've got, you know, freedom if the slave master dies in this case. And Aavlos says on page 82, in addition, the children of slave women could be co-inheritors with the children of the former wife, and in contrast to the cruel attitude expressed by Sarah concerning Ishmael, Abraham's biological son by Hagar, a slave woman in Genesis 21:10, which states, Genesis, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. God tells Abraham to follow this injunction in Genesis 21:12, regardless of Abraham's sympathy for Ishmael. So where Abraham might represent a humanizing tendency, God demands the more inhumane option. And that's really pretty clear there, where God's humanity lies, or doesn't. Paul repeats and endorses Sarah's cruel actions in Galatians 4:30, which should be counted as a regression relative to the rights of the children of slave women in the Code of Hammurabi. Even Mendelssohn, who's a scholar that we mentioned earlier, that appears to not only quote his sources rather problematically, but gets quoted by further apologists pretty problematically, and the main source that Stark cites for his pronouncements on ancient Near Eastern law. And Mendelssohn admits that, quote, and this is from Mendelssohn's Slavery in the Ancient Near East, page 122, the recognition that the slave, though legally a chattel, was a human being, and that as such he possessed certain inalienable rights, found its expression also in the law codes. The Hammurabi Code recognized as legally binding a marriage contract between a slave and a freeborn woman, and although legally the slave with all his possessions was the property of the master, the children born of such a marriage were free. In actuality, Mendelssohn had many other comments that showed Near Eastern law in a better light, but Stark and others seem to ignore them. So this is the real cherry picking that we see from people like Rodney Stark to choose the very worst ancient Near Eastern laws and the very best biblical laws and compare them. One being a generalization of the entire ancient Near East and all the legal law codes, and there were many law codes in the ancient Near East. Lipa Ishtar, Namu, the Hittite law codes, the Code of Hammurabi, etc., etc. And the Bible law codes, and the Covenant Code, and the laws that we see throughout the Bible. And Stark will choose the best here and the worst there and say, look how much better the Bible is, and that is not a good move. So we move on to Leviticus 25:42. Who's your master? So 25:42 says, Leviticus, for they are my servants, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They should not be sold as slaves. This is a pretty important point in looking at other Mesopotamian law codes. The idea that here in Leviticus 25:42, they're my servants, God's servants. You're slaves to me, but you're not slaves to other people. This is what Moshe Weinfeld says in Social Justice in Ancient Israel and in the Ancient Near East, a 1995 book. He says, but there is a decisive difference between the Israelite approach and that of Mesopotamia or Egypt. So he's trying to say this is a trajectorial approach, which is the Bible is better than anything else that came before it or appeared at the same time. In Israel, servitude to God is expressed as submission to the divine will and to his religious and ethical commandments, while in Mesopotamia and Egypt it is literally understood as service of the gods in their temple. Thus, in the inscription of Manistusu, king of Akkad, 22nd century BCE, we read that he, quote, he freed 38 cities from Corvée and from Levi that they might serve on behalf of the temple of the god Shamash alone. So this is a case of, looking at abstract servitude as opposed to, in temple servitude. The point is that, when we go back to Leviticus, God is talking about my servants, they can't be sold as slaves. And then Weinfeld here is saying that there was this transference as well that took place in Mesopotamia, and talking about King Akkad, and he's saying, he freed 38 cities, that they might serve on behalf of the temple of the god Shamash. So they go into like temple servitude. So like an abstract god servitude is so much better in the Bible than this kind of the master being the temple in Mesopotamia, for example. But Weinfeld does not mention that Israel had itself a whole class of temple slaves. We see that in 1 Chronicles 9:2, and Nehemiah 5:7. And this is a quote from Zev Folk in Hebrew Law in Biblical Times, who observes that the temple slaves called Nethinim, dedicated, developed in the course of time into a cultic guild of religious functionaries and returned from Babylonian exile together with other strata of Hebrew society. So Aavlos says on page 84, so why is Manitsu's dedication of some people to temple service regarded as characteristic of Mesopotamian practice when a similar variety of slave assignments can be observed in the Bible? And goes on to say, third problem with this approach is that the release of Hebrew slaves was comparatively less onerous because Deuteronomy in particular used outsiders to do labour that Israelites might not want to do. So again, if you're seeing this sort of transference and saying, okay, these people don't need to be slaves, I am your master God saying this. You don't need to be slaves in this temple setup or whatever setup it is, because actually we've got non-Hebrews to do that. So it's not a case that here's an example of God being against slavery. It's like, well, we still got certain, levels of temple slavery going on anyway. And also, I don't need you to be slaves because we've got other people to be slaves who we like less than you. So, again, the Bible isn't the progressive document that these scholars are claiming it to be. We move on to Leviticus 25, 35 to 43, which is Jubilee manumission. So it's a famous sort of thing that happens. I'll explain in a little bit, but to quote page 84 and 5 of Aavlos, he talks about Paul Copan, famous Paul Copan, whose book, Is God a Moral Monster, is often held up as, the great apologist treatment of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. So Paul Copan sees the releasing of Hebrew slaves in the 7th year as a moral advancement. That's a jubilee. He, quote, Hebrew debt slaves, which could be compared to indentured servants during the founding of America. So here, this is a really common thing, which is say, debt slaves aren't really proper slaves. They're more like servants that you might have seen in some of the American South. Or, the founding of America. It's like, some real cherry picking going on there. Copan continues, were to be granted release in the 7th year, Leviticus 29, 35 to 43. A notable improvement over other A&E law codes. Yet this seems to contradict his own footnote 52, says Aavlos, his footnote says, this is Copan's footnote, saying, because remember he said that these slaves get released in the 7th year, and anyway they're indentured servants, they're not really slaves. The Code of Hammurabi, says Paul Copan in a footnote, also makes provision for manumission. So why is the release of slaves, manumission, in Leviticus an improvement over the Code of Hammurabi, which also has manumission? So in one footnote he says, they get manumission in the Code of Hammurabi, but then he says, look at the wonderful Jubilee manumission that we see in the Bible. So in fact, Leviticus 25 can be seen as worse than the Code of Hammurabi manumission. So Aavlos says that chapter, verses 8 to 13, also advocates release of slaves in the year of Jubilee, which would be the 50th or 49th year. As Matityahu Tsevat notes, in the extreme case, a slave would have to work 49 years, in an average case 24 years, leaving out of consideration failing health or early death. In addition, says Aavlos, the Code of Hammurabi does not restrict manumission to Babylonians, whereas Leviticus restricts manumission to Hebrews. So Hammurabi's code seems more open and without regard to ethnicity here. So that's again really important that we saw earlier, which is, okay, your lovely laws, progressed laws, as according to you, Christian, of the Hebrew Bible only apply to the Hebrew slaves, and you're forgetting what happens to all these other slaves that aren't accorded the same humane rights. And that's really something of a problem. And long before Leviticus 25, Mesopotamian kings promulgated so-called Misharim equity acts, which could include the release of whole classes of people. And these could happen at 9, 6 and 7 years, depending on which king you're talking about and whatnot. So these really are comparable to the 7-year Jubilee laws that we see in Leviticus. So, this isn't the great moral progress, again, that apologists claim it is. Now, the next one, Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, enslaving outsiders, is a super important one. I won't read the whole Leviticus quote. It's quite a long one. But basically it says, be nice to Hebrews. You can own and do what you like to people who non-Hebrew slaves. Essentially, I mean it's pretty stark there, and this is a whole kind of in-group privilege that really represents the different valuations of life depending on where you're born. It's almost like it's almost against God here is declaring things that are against what God declares as Jesus in the New Testament in terms of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is a kind of a quest for universal morality, and the idea that be nice to the outgroup. Whereas here we're saying you can enslave the outgroup. It's fine, enslave the outgroup. Be nice to your own. It's like, and this is. Robert Price talks about this in his book, blaming Jesus for Jehovah, and the idea that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are two completely separate entities. And here's a really good example. The slavery in the Old Testament is overtly morally reprehensible. I mean, there's a whole chapter on the New Testament we'll deal with much later, or next, so not that much later. And then we move on to, that's just a quick, I advise you go and read Leviticus 25, 44 to 46. This is Deuteronomy 15 and the inner biblical progress. So this is a claim that you get that trajectorialism, that trajectory of like moral progress, either starting with the Bible is the most important part, and everything progresses from there. There's a claim by some apologists that you get a progress within the Bible. So you get some of the more harsh biblical slavery laws are then trumped by more progressive ones as you go through the Bible. But Paul Copan says, on the other hand, Israel's laws reveal a dramatic humanizing improvement over the practices of the other A&E peoples. But within the Bible, he says we also find improvement. And to continue Paul Copan, he says, what is more, and this is from Is Yahweh a Moral Monster? What is more, the three main texts regarding slave legislation, Exodus 21, Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15, reveal a morally improved legislation as the text progresses. End quote. But of course, this claim that he makes already assumes a chronology where Exodus 21 is written before Leviticus 25 and before Deuteronomy 15, and that could be challenged. And is still debated. So it could present a problem in and of itself making that claim. The problem I would say to this, Aavlos doesn't talk about this. The problem I would say to this is that if in this very short, well, in this book that you come to read later, right? What's the point of including those first two sets of laws? Just go for the third. And really, if those three moral laws aren't, conceptually that far apart, why did you have to do the first two? Why couldn't that third law have been instituted at the beginning? And this is a whole problem with the moral laws at all. Why you have to have this trajectory at all? Why is this all a movement towards where we are now? Why couldn't God say at the time? And even if, the argument is often, we wouldn't have understood that slavery was bad at the time. We needed all these incremental changes. And it's like, are you serious? Like, literally, Moses, like I said before, could have come down with the tablets and said, the rule number one is don't have slaves. I don't really understand why we shouldn't have slaves. They seem all right to me, right? Says Moses. But if God says we shouldn't have it, let's not have them. right? Let's not have slavery, because God says with loads of exclamation marks that this is a really bad idea. It's morally bad to own other humans. I don't see that that's conceptually that far out. But even if it is conceptually far out, if God just orders it on pain of death, then he's made a much greater moral claim. But instead, for 1,900 years, for the last 2,000, slavery is justified by using the Bible. And we've got a problem. So that internal biblical, trajectory, I think presents its own problem. Rather than singing its praises, it actually presents a problem for Christians. Deuteronomy 23:15 and fugitive slaves. So according to Rodney Stark, Deuteronomy 23:15 shows humanitarian advances, especially when compared to the Code of Hammurabi, which prescribed death for anyone who helped a slave to escape, says Rodney Stark. So Deuteronomy 23:15 to 16 says, "You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst in a place which he shall choose within one of your towns where it pleases him best. You shall not oppress him." So Aavlos says on page 88 that, however, it's not clear that Stark is comparing analogous laws, because he overlooks why hiding a slave should be viewed as an act of reappropriating someone else's property rather than helping slaves gain freedom. So in actuality, Stark does not specifically cite the law in the Code of Hammurabi he is referencing. Stark depends on Mendelssohn, again, and the latter is referring to laws 15 to 20 of the Code of Hammurabi. Unfortunately, Stark does not tell readers that Mendelssohn also says, quote, "The death penalty decreed by the Hammurabi Code for enticing a slave to flee or for harbouring a fugitive slave seems to have become obsolete by the Neo-Babylonian period." Back to Aavlos. So why does that not count as a humanitarian advance? This is a case of cherry picking another scholar to present, in this case, Rodney Stark's own conclusions, and not really understanding what was going on with with those ancient Near Eastern law codes, in this case, the Code of Hammurabi. But there you go. But there are some issues with the understanding of the Code of Hammurabi here, and in fact, it doesn't look like people harboring slaves should be killed anyway. I think Aavlos does some analysis here, and the belief is actually that they're only killed if they refuse to basically give over the slave when it was demanded of them. But it's also analogous to Exodus 21:16 that Sprinkle, the apologist we mentioned earlier, said was a humanitarian advance in and of itself in prescribing the same, the Code of Hammurabi prescribes the same death penalty against man stealing, which is effectively what this is. Aavlos discusses an awful lot more points to do with this. I won't dwell on this one. There's some very intricate points, but you can find it on pages 88 to 90. The next one is 1 Samuel 8, an exclusive service to Yahweh. So Dexter Calendar offers a well-known argument for the distinctiveness of Hebrew slavery when he refers to 1 Samuel 8 as part of the evidence for his larger thesis, which is, quote, and this is, Dexter Calendar in Servants of God, chapter Servants of God and Servants of Kings, in the book Slavery in Text and Interpretation. So Calendar says, Israelite exclusive servitude to God is then precisely the basis for its sharp rejection of all forms of human servitude, whether chattel slavery, the prolongation of debt slavery, or forced labour. You're thinking, hang on, I'm fairly sure that there's been heaps of countenancing of exactly that, and now you're saying like servitude to God exclusively rules out all these other things, but there you go. So 1 Samuel 8:7 and 11 and 16 to 17 say, "And the Lord said to Samuel, hearken to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. He will take your manservants and maidservants and the best of your cattle and your asses and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks and you shall be his slaves. This kind of harkens back to Leviticus 25:55 that says, "For to me the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So this idea that, Yahweh as the only king kind of is a rejection of all other forms of monarchy, really, as a form of unacceptable slavery. But of course, if all forms of human servitude are rejected because the Israelites see themselves as exclusive servants of Yahweh, then how can there even be debt slavery at all? All these other mentions of forms of slavery in the Bible that have been countenanced and that we've just been talking about all this time, and apologists are explaining away and saying, well, this is a slightly better form of slavery than we saw before. If now we're saying, well, this particular chapter and verse says that all debt slavery and forced labor and human servitude is rejected in light of the fact that God is your only slave master, really, it just makes no sense. How does not prolonging debt slavery show that all forms of human servitude are rejected? By that logic, all Mizraim acts in Mesopotamia can mean that Mesopotamians rejected all forms of human servitude. So this idea that if you're going to use that logic, you can look at the nice bits of the manumission in certain Mesopotamian law codes and say, well, that represents the approach to all Mesopotamian slavery laws, and so therefore it's just like, it doesn't make any sense. So Aavlos says on page 91, second calendar is engaging in representativism insofar as he believes 1 Samuel 8 represents all Israelite attitudes towards servitude to human beings or kinship. But of course, all the other chapters and verses we've been talking about show that that's not the case, or it's an extreme cherry picking. But actually, you only have to look so far as 1 Samuel 9:16 to show that, even within Samuel, you've got a problem here. First, 1 Samuel 9:16 says, "Tomorrow about this time I will send to you a man from this land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He shall save my people from the land of the Philistines, for I have seen the affliction of my people, because their cry has come to me." And in fact, other tradents even enjoin Judeans to serve foreign kings, as does Jeremiah 27:6-11. I'm not going to read that, but you can go and read that. So, why not deem these texts as representative of Yahweh's preferences for Israel's servitude to kings and princes and even foreign kings? Just, the fact, and this is Aavlos on page 91, the fact is that even the passages that Calendar, so this chap at the beginning, Dexter Calendar, who's trying to claim here that these are representative of biblical approaches to human servitude, the passages that Calendar cites for support do not show that Yahweh's exclusive claims of rulership was incompatible with all forms of human servitude. Serving Yahweh was always done through human intermediaries and institutions. Serving Yahweh could mean serving an Israelite king or a foreign king, such as Nebuchadnezzar, who is also deemed God's servant. So it's just, it's contradicted, within that book, but also within all of the Hebrew Bible. But also, if you look at other books, and Deuteronomy and Deuteronomic histories, Deuteronomistic histories, you have, instead of serving as intermediaries a god or a prince, you have prophets and priests. Deuteronomy 18:15, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren, him you shall heed." In other words, monarchy was only one form of servitude to Yahweh, and rejecting monarchy did not mean rejecting all forms of human servitude. You could serve your prophet or your high priest and all this. So the argument is just, dead in the water. Then let's move on to Ezra 2:64-65 and slave societies for a little bit of analysis. This is the idea that, most analyses done by, Christian historians and apologists say, well, there really weren't many slaves in the society at the time. Slavery in the ancient Near East differed from other slave cultures, and there just weren't many. Dexter Callender, for example, quotes Roland de Vaux in saying, "In Israel and the neighbouring countries, there never existed those enormous gangs of chattel slaves which in Greece and Rome continually threatened the balance of social order." So in other words, many Christian apologists claim that the ancient Israel was not a slave society on par with neighbouring cultures or New World slavery. So how wonderful is this slavery that we see in Israel, in terms of numbers anyway. But the problem is, I mean, you can look for 1 Kings 5:13, where King Solomon raised a levy of forced labour out of all Israel, and the levy numbered 30,000 men. Solomon also had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 hewers of stone in the hill country. This could be just a claim that Solomon was not the king he should have been, but here we have some stats to show this might not be the case. Ezra 2:64-65 says, quote, "The whole assembly together was 42,360, besides their men servants and maid servants, of whom there were 7,337, and they had 200 male and female singers." These figures, back to Aavlos, these figures show that the percentage of slaves, at least in this returning community of Jewish exiles, because that's what Ezra is talking about here, compares quite reasonably with what we find in a list of large-scale slave systems and compiled, for example, by Orlando Patterson, and even when we use figures accepted by Rodney Stark. So actually here the percentage was worked out to be 14%. 14% of the people returning here was effectively slaves, and that compares with contemporaneous societies, pretty much spot on. So and Aavlos, analyzes this on page 93, and we're almost there, you'll be happy to know. So again, the claim there weren't many slaves is actually pretty much disproved by the biblical claims themselves. We move on to Job 31:13-15, and justice for slaves. So that quote is, "If I have rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb?" So is a kind of equality for all, I guess. But again, all those previous or other biblical moral dictates about slaves and in-group, out-group slaves show very clearly a massive chasm in human valuation between Hebrews and other slaves. But we can also see that this kind of universalism existed elsewhere. Epictetus told us that slaves and masters are all, quote, "kinsmen, brethren by nature, the offspring of Zeus." The Sumerian laws of Lipa Ishtar allowed slaves to bring suits against their masters. So this passage in Job is not necessarily more humanitarian than we can find in the ancient Near East, and is, of course, disproven by all the other biblical passages that very clearly show slaves are not, don't have equity with non-slaves. And finally, Joel 2:28-29, possessing slaves. Biblical scholar Henneke Gutzlow proclaims this text to be revolutionary, and the quote is, "And it shall come," Joel 2:28-29 says, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even upon the men servants and maid servants in those days, I will pour out my spirit." But this idea that it's particularly revolutionary really is pretty insignificant. as Aavlos says on page 95, Goodslow believes that pouring out the Spirit on slaves indicates their full participation in God's community. However, slaves who prophesied through some sort of spirit possession were already known in antiquity. At Mari, 18th century BCE, for example, one document tells us, quote, in the temple of Anunitum, in the city of Ahatum, a servant girl of Dagan Malek went into a trance and spoke. Goodslow ignores the fact that nothing is said in Joel about emancipating the slaves. They may be slaves who are being possessed by a divine spirit, but their bodies remained possessed by earthly masters. I mean, it's just like, yeah, whatever. You know, even manservants and maidservants, I will pour out my spirit onto them. Yeah, brilliant. But you're also saying, oh yeah, you can keep them for as long as possible and have sex with the virgins, and you can do all this, and you can do all that, and blah, blah, blah. But hey, they've got my spirit. If you think that's revolutionary, then I don't know, you're living in a different world than I am. So the summary for this whole chapter, big old chapter, and it's taken me 2 videos, and I do apologize, a lot of me talking about particular slave chapters and verses in the Bible and other contemporaneous sources. On page 95, the summary that Aavlos gives is this brief survey of representative biblical passages shows a repeated attempt by modern biblical scholars to mitigate the ethical implications of slavery in the Hebrew Bible. Some scholars ignore the slavery theme, and he gives some citations there, and others try to engage in comparative ethics in order to show the superiority of biblical directives, and some more citations of people we talked about: Sprinkle, Weinfeld, Stark, Canada, Pope. A repeated technique is to compare the biblical best with the pagan worst. In all cases, we can find misrepresentation of neighbouring cultures and or the omission of countervailing examples and evidence. That being in both the contemporaneous sources from the ancient Near East or preceding sources, as well as from the Bible itself. There's just, you know, massive cherry picking, masses of representativism, and, you know, a really problematic approach to trajectorialism. Anyway, I hope that's of some use. It's looking again at the particular instances of slavery and the declarations of slavery within the Hebrew Bible. Next, we'll be moving on to chapter 5, which is slavery as mentioned in the New Testament, and might look somewhat different to the sorts of slavery that are discussed in the Old Testament. And we'll talk about it in there. And there you go. Thank you so much for listening. This has been an hour of me just banging on about certain biblical quotes and what scholars, how they deal with them, Christian scholars particularly, and how problematic that is. As ever, you know, like, subscribe, do all those things. Please share if you find this interesting at all, and hopefully, you know, you're getting something out of this continual journey through the book. If you have the wherewithal, please, you know, there's a thanks function below, because it's not a live video. You can also join, become a member of my channel for a few perks, and that would be really, really appreciated. And, you know, question everything, especially yourselves. See you next time.